My name is Emily Carter, and until I was 25 years old, I believed I knew exactly who I was. I knew my blood type. I knew my birthday. I knew the story of how my mother almost didn't make it to the hospital in time because my father got lost driving in a snowstorm. None of it was true. The people who raised me were not my biological parents. I found it out on a random Tuesday night from a stranger's message on a DNA testing app. And when I finally learned who my real parents were and what they had done, I understood exactly why my adoptive parents had spent 2.5 decades making sure I never asked questions. This is that story. Stay until the end, because the last 20 minutes of this video are going to change how you see every normal family you've ever met. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, in a quiet cul-de-sac where everyone knew everyone. My parents, David and Linda Carter, were the kind of people neighbors described as solid. My dad worked at an insurance office. My mom taught 3rd grade. We went to church on Sundays. Not because we were especially religious, but because it's what you did in a town like ours. I was an only child, which I always assumed was just how things worked out. My mom used to joke that I arrived exactly when I was supposed to, and I never thought twice about the odd way she phrased it. Looking back now, there were signs, small ones. The fact that there wasn't a single baby photo of me before I was about 8 months old. The fact that my mom always changed the subject whenever anyone brought up her pregnancy with me. The fact that my parents' wedding anniversary was only 14 months before my birthday, which, if you do the math, is technically possible, but combined with everything else, should have raised a flag. It never did. Because when you trust a people completely, you don't look for reasons not to. I went to college 2 hours away, became a physical therapist, and moved back closer to home in my mid-20s. I had a boyfriend, Jake, a decent apartment, and a life that felt ordinary. Good, but ordinary. Then, for my 25th birthday, my best friend Sophie gave me one of those home DNA kits as a joke gift. Find out if you're secretly royalty, she said. I spit in the tube, mailed it off, and honestly forgot about it for 6 weeks. The results came back on a Tuesday night in October. I remember because I was eating leftover pad thai on my couch, half watching a show I wasn't paying attention to. I opened the app expecting percentages 60% Irish, 20% German, that kind of thing. Instead, the first thing I saw was a notification. You have one close family match. I clicked it, expecting maybe a cousin. Instead, the app showed a woman named Karen Whitfield, 51 years old, and the relationship estimate read half-sibling, 99.2% confidence. I sat there staring at my phone for a full minute. I didn't have a half-sibling. I was an only child. I texted Sophie, hey, this is probably a glitch, right? She called me back within 30 seconds. Emily, these tests don't glitch like that. Message her. I didn't message her that night. I called my mom instead. I asked her, half laughing, hey, weird question, did dad have another kid before we met, or something? This DNA app is saying I have a half-sister. There was a silence on the other end of the phone that lasted just a bit too long. Emily, sweetheart, we should talk about this in person, my mom said. Can you come over this weekend? That sentence, we should talk about this in person, is when I knew. Some part of me, deep down, already understood that whatever she was about to tell me wasn't going to be a small thing. That weekend, I sat at the same kitchen table I'd eaten breakfast at my entire childhood, and my parents told me I was adopted. They told me it as gently as they could. They'd adopted me privately, through a lawyer, when I was 3 months old. They had wanted to tell me when the time was right. And somehow, that time had never come. 25 years slipped by, and the longer they waited, the harder it became to say it out loud. My mom was crying. My dad kept apologizing. And honestly, in that moment, I wasn't even angry, I was numb. I remember asking one question, over and over. Who are my real parents? My mom hesitated, then told me what she knew. My biological mother's name was Diane Reyes. She had been 20 years old at the time. The adoption had been arranged quickly, quietly, and my parents had been told almost nothing about the circumstances, only that the birth mother was not in a position to care for a child, and that there had been some family difficulties. My biological father's name wasn't even on the paperwork. That night, I finally messaged the woman from the DNA app, Karen Whitfield, my apparent half-sister. She responded almost immediately, and what she told me over the next 2 weeks, through messages, then phone calls, then eventually a flight out to meet her in person in Arizona, unraveled everything I thought I understood about where I came from. Karen explained that our biological father was a man named Richard Voss. She was his daughter from an earlier relationship. She'd grown up seeing him only a handful of times a year, and even then, something about him had always frightened her. He wasn't a warm person, Karen told me over coffee. the first time we met face to face. My mom used to say there were two versions of him, the one people saw, and the one you saw when you were alone with him. I asked her what she meant. She told me that when she was 17, she'd learned that Richard had been investigated, never charged, but investigated, in connection with the disappearance of a woman he'd been seeing in his 20s. The case went cold. Nobody was ever found. Richard moved to a different state a year later, and according to Karen, reinvented himself as a well-liked contractor with a wide social circle and no obvious past. I remember sitting there, my coffee going cold in my hands, thinking, this can't be about me. This has to be a coincidence. But then Karen said the sentence that changed the direction of my entire search. Emily, the timeline you gave me. Your birth mother, Diane. She went missing for almost a year right around the time you were born. And nobody in our family ever heard your father mention her name again. I didn't sleep the night. I went home and started digging through old newspaper archives, court records, anything public I could find with Diane Ray's name on it. What I found was a missing persons report, filed by Diane's older sister, Carol, roughly 2 months after I would have been born. The report said Diane had last been seen leaving her apartment to meet a friend and never returned. It also noted that Diane had recently given birth and that the baby's whereabouts were unknown to the family. My stomach dropped, because as far as anyone in Diane's family knew, I had disappeared too. I found Carol's contact information through an old genealogy forum post, and I called her the next morning. I told her who I was. There was a long pause on the line, and then she started to cry. We looked for you for years, Carol said. We thought maybe he'd done something to both of you. Carol told me the full story, the one that had been buried for 25 years. Diane had met Richard Voss when she was 19. He was older, charming, controlling in ways that seemed like devotion. At first, always wanting to know where she was, always just checking in. By the time Diane realized how deep his control ran, she was already pregnant with me. According to Carol, in the final months of the pregnancy, Diane had confided that she was terrified of Richard, not of him hurting her physically, at least not yet, but of what she discovered: records, financial documents, and an old newspaper clipping about the missing woman from years before, tucked away in a box in his closet. Diane believed Richard had been involved in that woman's disappearance, and she believed that once the baby was born, he intended for them to disappear into his life completely off the grid, cut off from her own family. So Diane made a plan. She told no one, not even Carol, the full details. She arranged, through a private adoption attorney, to place me with a family the moment I was born, specifically so that if anything happened to her, I would already be somewhere safe, somewhere Richard could never trace. 2 months after I was placed with the Carters, Diane disappeared. Her case was never solved. Richard was questioned, but never charged. There wasn't enough evidence, and he had an alibi from a coworker for the weekend she vanished. He moved away not long after. The same pattern Karen had described from years earlier. Carol told me that for over 2 decades, her family had lived with 2 open wounds, not knowing what happened to her sister, and not knowing what happened to the baby Diane had been so desperate to protect. You were the one thing she did right, Carol told me, her voice breaking. She got you out. Whatever happened to her, she made sure it didn't happen to you too. I sat with that for a long time. The realization that the woman who gave birth to me hadn't given me a way out of indifference. She had given me a way as an act of protection. Possibly the last deliberate choice she ever got to make. I asked Carol the question I was almost afraid to ask. Did she think Richard was still alive? She said yes. Public records showed a Richard Voss, now in his early 60s, living under a slightly altered version of his name in another state. No new charges, no new disappearances that anyone had connected to him, just a quiet life, decades removed from the people whose lives he'd unraveled. I'm not going to pretend this story has a clean, happy ending, because it doesn't. Diane's case is technically still open, though after this many years, investigators told Carol not to expect new developments unless something unexpected surfaces. I've since given a DNA sample to a cold case database, in case it ever helps close her file. What I did gain, though, was family I didn't know I had. Carol and I talk every week now. Karen and I still message constantly. We've become closer than a lot of people who grew up in the same house. And my adopted parents, David and Linda, the 2 people who raised me without ever telling me any of this, I've forgiven them. Not because what they did was right, but because I finally understand why they did it. They were terrified that if I ever learned the truth too early, I'd go looking for a man who had already, in all likelihood, hurt someone who loved me. Sometimes people ask me if I regret taking that DNA test. My best friend's joke birthday gift. I don't, because for 25 years, I lived a life that was built on a story that wasn't true. It was a kind story, told by people who loved me, but it wasn't true. Now I know exactly who I am, where I come from, and what one woman was willing to sacrifice so that I get the chance to have a life at all. If you're watching this and you've ever taken one of these DNA tests just for fun, know that you might be one email away from a story you never expected. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. I share real adapted stories like this every week. Drop a comment below telling me what part shocked you the most. And if you want to hear what happened when Emily and Karen finally met their father's current family, let me know, because that's a story on its own. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.